With that, I think we will move on to our next speaker, who is Dr. Peter Thiel. He's a senior scientist at Aarhus University in Denmark, and he was recently appointed adjunct professor at Sichuan Agricultural University in China. He earned his PhD in 2002 from Aarhus University, where his dissertation was focused on energy and protein metabolism in sows. He also spent 4 months as a postdoctoral researcher in Dr. Walter Hurley's lab at the University of Illinois. Dr. Thiel's research focuses on improving sow productivity, piglet survival, and piglet growth, and particularly the nutrition of transition sows to achieve faster farrowing and greater yields of colostrum and milk. These research projects are a great benefit to the pig industry and are often in collaboration with the Danish Pig Research Center and feedstuff companies. He leads the Monogastric Nutrition and Physiology Group at Aarhus University and is a member of the Danish National Board for Nutrient Recommendations for Pigs. Dr. Thiel is also joining us virtually this morning, so his talk will be recorded, and then he will join us live at the end for questions. So help me welcome Dr. Thiel.
Okay, thank you very much to the organizers and especially to John Patience for inviting me to give this presentation. Unfortunately, I was not allowed to come to the US, which I was really unhappy when I realized that last week, but that's how it is. So I'm really happy that I could give my presentation using a video recording. And then I'll take your questions right after my presentation. So today I'll talk about first the farrowing process and how that affects the stillborn piglets. Then I'll talk about how sows produce colostrum. What can we do to enhance the yield of the sows? And also what can we do with the milk yields? What does body condition, body mobilization and affect these things? And what about the feed efficiency? How do we define that? And what should we do to really improve the nutrition of the hyperprolific sows? If we start considering what is special for the hyperprolific sows, it's of course the litter size. It has increased dramatically from approximately 12 in 1992 up to more than 18 today, so more than a 50% increase over approximately 30 years. That has really challenged the productivity. The farrowing length has increased. We need more colostrum to be produced by the sow, and we need the sows to produce more milk as well. The question is, can we improve these traits by nutrition, and how should we do it? If we consider their energy requirements, which is really an important aspect of nutrition, we can see the energy requirement during late gestation, during the transition period, and throughout lactation. That really changes dramatically. We have energy required for fetal growth, mammary growth, colostrum and milk production, for the uterus, and also for the sow maintenance. And we can do a lot of factorial calculations as we've been doing here, but in reality, we don't really know how precise and how accurate these calculations are. And especially the transition period is a period where we don't know really much how we should predict those. And what do I mean when I talk about the transition period? I define the transition period to last, say, 3 to 5 days before parturition up until 1 week after parturition. So approximately 10 to 12 days around parturition, that is what I define as the transition period. If I put a black figure on top of that, you can easily see, well, the requirement of energy doesn't change much in late gestation. The requirement of energy jumps to a very different level in peak lactation. And these two phases, they are very constant. That means we can fairly well target their nutrient requirements with a single diet in gestation and another diet in lactation. But what about the transition period where everything changes day by day? That is really what I've been focusing on for quite some years now. And I'm particularly concerned about the parturition because a lot of different things goes on, which is so important for the sow productivity. Just a few years ago, we considered the colostrum being that it was produced when the sow was approaching farrowing. Just by visually looking at the mammary gland of the sow, you would say they are filled with colostrum. We have realized that is not the case. Then after colostrum was produced, then the sow enters a phase where she is starting to build a nest, which takes a lot of energy as well. We don't know how much, but that lasts, say, 10, 15, 20, 25 hours. It depends on the individual, but clearly it takes a lot of extra energy. And then we have the uterine contractions. During the farrowing, she spent a lot of energy on expelling the piglets through the birth canal. But today we know we have to reconsider the chronology because the nest building is the first thing of these three traits that happens. That happens just before the farrowing. Then when farrowing onsets, the uterine contractions become really strong. And as the piglets are being born and remove colostrum, the sow is responding by producing more and more colostrum in the mammary gland. So we have realized within the last 2 or 3 years that colostrum is mainly produced after the firstborn piglet is born. And I'll show you how we came to that conclusion. And that has also some implications on how we should really try to focus in the future, I believe. Looking into the farrowing process, we realized some years ago that sows, they seem to run out of energy. If they are not lucky to start fairly early after the last meal was consumed, then they were really in a danger of being exhausted and having a really prolonged farrowing duration. So in best case, sows farrowed on average within 4 hours. But that could be 3 times higher if they were unlucky to not start until 8 or 10 hours after the last meal. And in that case, they maybe skipped a meal because they didn't want to eat the very last meal just before starting. A very strong response that illustrated energy is really, really important for the sow during the farrowing process. We've done a follow-up study on this to understand what is the optimal feed supply for sows when they approach the farrowing. We did a dose response trial and we had 6 different doses ranging from 1.8 kilogram per day up to 5.0 kilogram per day. Sows were fed 3 meals a day, and we expected a curvilinear response in different traits like this, where a low response here illustrates a successful farrowing. We looked into farrowing length, we looked into farrowing assistance and other traits. And why did we expect a curvilinear relationship? Well, at the low end here, the low feed intake, we expect sows would be energy depleted, and that would cause the extended farrowing durations. But at the high feed supply, we also expected a high and extended farrowing duration, simply because when we feed sows a lot of feed, then the undigested fiber, they may actually physically block the birth canal due to filling up the hindgut. And that's the same as if we have constipated sows, a physical blockage can really prevent the piglets from being born. What did we see in our experiment? We saw that a curvilinear response, a decline as we supplied more and more feed to the sows, and then at some point it started to increase again. This was just according to our expectations. All we just wanted was to understand what is the optimum. And we can use different polynomials to fit an optimum. We used here a a cubic polynomial to measure this, and we realized that we found an optimum of 4.1 kilogram per day. It was a tendency, but fitted very well with our expectations, I would say. Well, we expected them to have an optimum lower than 4.1, but this was what we found. And I could tell the Danish recommendation before we gave this was around 2.9 kilogram. So clearly higher than we used to feed sows. That was where we found the optimum. If we consider the farrowing assistance, which is another important trait and maybe a more sensitive trait than the farrowing duration, and also the more sensitive trait than the stillbirth rate, that is the farrowing assistance. That really showed a clear change and a clear significant response. Again, an unsuccessful farrowing if sows were supplied in an adequate amount of energy, and then it dropped down and increased again because of the physical blockage. And also for the farrowing assistance, we found an optimum of 4.1 kilogram. Moving on to the stillbirth rate, we did not see a significant response here. You could say we saw a weak tendency, but what I find particularly interesting is we saw a very nice curvilinear relationship, just like we saw from the other traits, and that we would expect. And we see a twofold reduction in the stillborn piglets from the lowest feed supply to the optimal feed supply. In this case, we found the optimum of 3.8 kilogram per day. In a study carried out in Finland, it was revealed that fiber is really good to reduce the constipation. This Finnish group, led by Olli Peltonimi and Olivio, they have made a scoring scale to evaluate whether constipation or whether feces consistency is acceptable or not. And we would like feces consistency of approximately 3. And fiber is really good to achieve that, whereas if we feed low fiber or if we feed low amount of feed, we risk sows to have more frequent constipation. We've done a study also where we looked into feces consistency, so not constipation, but clearly an indication of whether we could expect constipation or not. We saw in that study that if we feed sows a low fiber control diet, the probability of soft feces was clearly lower, and if we fed them high amount of fiber, then we saw an increased probability of soft feces. And sorry for the unit here, it should be percentages, of course. So fiber is beneficial for the feces consistency. It becomes more soft, and the likelihood of having constipation is reduced. A feces score of 3 is what I have taken a photo of here. That was more than 10 centimeter high, this fecal output here. We have done some other studies with fibers, and one of the things that we are particularly interested in, that is the impact of dietary fibers on piglet mortality. We did an experiment where we supplied sows with either a low fiber or an ordinary control gestation diet up until 1 week before parturition. Then we shifted it to a lactation diet, and then we replaced part of that in the fiber supplemented group. Part of the normal diet was replaced by a fiber-rich supplement. So we wanted to make sure that the sows had at least 500 grams of fiber on a daily basis the last 2 weeks before parturition. And what did we see? we saw a very, very clear, significant response on the stillbirth rate here. So by adding more fiber to the diet, we decreased the stillbirth rate from 8.7 to 6.6, 3-star significant response. We did not see much impact on the pre-weaning mortality. Numerically, it was okay, but not a statistical response. But the total mortality, so combining the stillbirth rate and the pre-weaning mortality, the overall total mortality was also clearly significantly reduced by the fiber-rich supplement. So fibers are really good for sows that are approaching the farrowing. Also, medication of sows in this case was numerically lower, not statistically, but all the things we studied was really beneficial for these sows. Let me take a look at or illustrate what happens when the sow ingests a meal and why is it important to really understand the nutrient dynamics. When we feed a meal to a sow, she would consume it within 10 to 20 minutes. And then already when the first nutrient hit the stomach, it will start to be digested by lactobacilli and release lactate, which can be taken up into the portal blood, and very fast the digested starch will start to move down in the GI tract and be taken up as glucose. When it does that, it moves along the small intestine, and the undigested material hits the cecum and the hindgut approximately 4 to 7 hours. So it takes 4 to 7 hours for the nutrients to pass through the gastrointestinal tract. And considering the fibers which are being fermented in the hindgut, they are staying there for quite a long time. They are slowly passing through the hindgut and staying there for at least 24 hours. That means also that in the hindgut we have undigested fiber from at least 3 previous meals. Whereas when we look into the small intestine, we only have nutrients from the very last meal, but in the hindgut we clearly have at least nutrients from the last 3 meals. So that's a fundamental difference. And this has some implications, because if we consider how much energy is taken up from the gastrointestinal tract into the portal blood, we can analyze how much glucose is coming in, how much lactate is coming in. We know the energy values of these compounds, and we can measure the short chain fatty acids as well. And we have measured acetate, propionate, butyrate, which are the 3 large ones. And when I sum up how much energy is derived from starch, I've added the contribution of glucose and lactate, and you can see a very, very pronounced increase in energy uptake, and it peaks very fast after the feed is consumed. 30 minutes, in our case, 30 minutes after the meal was served, we see the peak energy intake across the GI tract into the portal blood. So very, very fast degradation of the starch and uptake of glucose to the portal blood. And then it declines over time as the nutrients, more and more nutrients are moving along the GI tract. And after 7 hours, you can see not much starch or glucose is actually being taken up. In contrast, the fermented fibers give rise to uptake of short chain fatty acids that is very, very constant. It doesn't change, it hardly changes over the 8 hour we have measured, and after at 8 hour again we will feed them once again, and they will just continue to take up the same amount of short chain fatty acids. Another study by Serena and co-workers has shown they would have a very constant uptake of energy from fiber for at least 24 hours, even though they are only fed 1 meal per day. That will not happen for the digested starch. If we don't feed them again after 8 hours, this will decline to 0. And this is exactly what happens when a sow approaches the farrowing. Suddenly she is captured in a position where she is not able to raise up. She is having a high energy requirement during the farrowing process, and she is not raising up. Most are not raising up, while the farrow, if the feeding system suddenly deliver a meal. So there's a fundamental difference in terms of how beneficial starch are for the sows and the energy from the fiber, especially during the farrowing process. The good thing with this is if we double the fiber, the fiber level in the diet, then we will double the energy uptake from the short chain fatty acids. There's plenty of room for doubling the fiber level in the diet at late gestation, because they are not eating nearly as much as they would if they could, if they were fed according to appetite. So we can easily increase the energy being taken up from the fibers, and we can at the expense of the energy coming from the digested starch. We have tried to do that, and we have seen that, again, this is from the study where we realized that the time from the last meal until onset of farrowing, that is a very important trait. But we have studied that, what happened if we give sows a high fiber diet compared with a low fiber diet. This was not a huge response. It was not a statistically significant different response, but still these data, I believe, show what the fiber is doing. It somehow constantly refuel the sow with energy from the GI tract, from the hindgut, which is beneficial when the sow is farrowing, because she is not able to consume more energy when she is laying down. There's another study, I believe it was carried out in Czechoslovakia more than 10 years ago. They studied the farrowing length as in response to increased protein content in the sow feed. And they realized that if you oversupply sows with protein, then they would have an extended farrowing. So protein is not good. It's not a good energy source. And I'm really, I agree very much on this. But in this case, when I looked a bit deeper into this experimental setup, I actually realized maybe the protein content in that diet was not the only reason why the sows responded by such a high increase in farrowing length. Because when I took a look at the dietary formulation, it was pretty clear that while the protein content increased, the dietary fiber decreased. So probably the dietary fiber, or the effect of the dietary fiber, overruled the impact of the protein. Or maybe it was both, the combination. But at least high fiber is good for a sow that is approaching farrowing. Excessive amount of protein is not good for the sow that approached the farrowing. We've done a study to understand better what are the nutrients that are fueling the uterus, the energy metabolism when she is doing the farrowing. We did some surgeries in 10 sows. We put in catheters in different positions in the body, and 2 of the catheters was placed, one in the artery. We could choose any one we want, and one in the uterine vein, so we could make an arterial venous difference and understand what is the uterus taking up from the blood as to be used as a fuel for the hard-working uterus while the sow is farrowing. And what we realized was during farrowing, the sow takes up glucose and triglycerides, and only those two molecules of the big energy metabolites that we normally consider. We did not see any uptake of short-chain fatty acids. We did not see any uptake of NEFA, non-esterified fatty acids, and we did not see any uptake of lactate. Actually, we saw that the hard-working uterus was producing a bit lactate, most likely because they were lacking oxygen. So it was quite striking for us, not that the uterus was taking up glucose, we expected that, but it was striking or surprising that the sow uterus was taking up triglyceride. And I've been speculating why, what could explain that, and I've tried to make a table here. So this is the carbon input or uptake from the blood to the uterus that is represented here. You can see approximately 60% of the carbon or the energy is taken up as triglycerides, whereas only 40% roughly is taken up as glucose. And this is a very, very unusual pattern for a pig or a pig organ. Normally, you would say that glucogenic energy represent at least 80, if not 85% of the energy on a whole animal level. And the uterus working hard would clearly prefer glucogenic energy, not ketogenic energy coming from the triglyceride. I believe the reason why triglycerides were taken up instead of NEFA is that triglycerides has a very small molecule included, which is glycerol, and glycerol can be used instead of glucose when they are running out of glucogenic energy substrates. That's the only way I can explain that they prefer triglycerides on top of NEFA. Because normally when we are in a negative energy balance, and they become that during the parturition, we would release NEFA from the body fat stores to the blood, and that can be then used as a fuel, mainly in the liver. But I guess it could also have been used here in the uterus if they were not lacking that much glucogenic energy as they did. There was a group in Kansas in the US that studied meal frequency, and they were inspired by our finding where we saw that sows were being depleted of energy if they started to farrow quite late after the last meal. So they did a meal frequency study, compared 1 and 4 meals per day. They got exactly the same feed supply on a daily basis, but some of them got one group got only 1 meal and all the entire daily supply in 1 meal, and the other got 1/4 of the same amount, but then they received 4 equal meals throughout the day. They did not see any impact on the meal frequency, on farrowing duration, or stillbirth rate, but they did see less assisted farrowings, which, as I said earlier today, I believe that is a more sensitive measure than stillbirth rate and farrowing duration. So something was improved, although the stillbirth rate was not improved. I still speculate whether there are differences between the herd in the US and what we have seen here in Denmark, and I guess there are many differences. Just one of them is the litter size, of course, the management, the feeding strategy, and etc. is different. So I guess we cannot just conclude that there's no problem in the US with this, and we have a huge problem in Denmark, but I would say I'm very, very sure that energy is an important aspect. I'm not sure meal frequency is so important as I believed a couple of years ago, because I think we have solved most of the problem now by increasing the feed supply to sows when they approach farrowing. And the importance of energy and glycogenic energy, we demonstrated that in another study with multi-catheterized sows. We supplied sows with just 1 meal per day to challenge them to extend the number of hours passing from the very last meal until of farrowing. And we could see that if we infused intravenously glucose into these sows, we could demonstrate a significant response actually in stillbirth rate and less farrowing assistance compared to control sows where we infused saline. So based on these studies, we have changed our Danish recommendations. Before we did our studies and our findings, we recommended 3.3 kilogram per day during the last month, and during the last 2 to 3 days, that should be decreased to 2.4 or maybe less, reduced to 2.9 kilogram per day. But after we have realized sows are running out of energy, we do not recommend to reduce the feed supply. We actually recommend to feed at least 3.3 kilo and maybe the last few days go up to as much as 3.8 kilogram per day. And we don't have a recommendation of the fiber on a daily basis in Denmark, but we assume that 500 to 600 grams per day seems to be optimal for a successful farrowing. Moving on to the colostrum. This is from a French study with Elaine Canel and co-workers. She demonstrated nicely that it's really, really important for the piglet survival. If piglets consume a very small amount of colostrum, there's a very high risk that they die, and then it declines. And based on this follow-up studies, it is widely accepted that 250 grams of colostrum per piglet seems to be a critical lower limit. If we do some modeling, we can see that from our data, we can see that if the litter size increases, the colostrum yield of sows increases until a certain point of approximately 15 piglets within the litter. And after that, it seems like now it's the sow that is the limiting factor of the colostrum yield. So initially, it's the removal. More piglets can remove more, but at some point, the sow becomes the limiting factor. And we have passed that point where the piglet was the limiting factor. Now we are up here to 18 or 19 piglets being born, and we are at the level where the sow is the limiting factor. We need to do something to improve her productivity. Looking into the colostrum intake, we can see the more we increase the litter size, the less colostrum is being consumed by the individual piglet. And we are approximately here, approaching 300 grams on average. 10 years ago, we were on 400 grams, and we are actually approaching, as I see it, a disaster where we don't have enough colostrum even for the mean piglet in the litter, and then we have a severe problem if that ever happens. We want to understand how can we improve it, and we've been working quite a lot with that in my lab. And one thing that has caused us to not think correctly, I believe, is because we didn't know that colostrum was produced after the first piglet was born. So when we did some surgeries and compared the uptake of nutrients from the blood and the output from the mammary gland back to the blood or into the colostrum. And we can see a nearly one-to-one relationship between uptake and excretion and secretion that illustrates this colostrum is being produced after the first piglet is born. It is not pre-produced in late gestation. We can also see that if we feed fibers, it seems like a bit is pre-produced, so most likely the sow is retaining some fat in the mammary gland that can be used and spare some glucose during the farrowing and during the colostrum phase. And they can actually produce more fat in the colostrum if we use fiber in late gestation. So that's maybe one of the reasons why fiber in late gestation is important. We studied what is the optimum for optimal feed supply to sows when to have an optimal colostrum production. We realized 3.0 kilogram per day is the optimum, which is way below the optimum for a successful farrowing, where we found 3.8 to 4.1 kilogram of feed per day. So, and we can't choose to give them two different amounts. We have to choose either should we go for an optimum colostrum production or an optimal farrowing, or should we stick to somewhere in between those two? That's one of the challenges we face today. What about fibers and colostrum performance? We did a study more than 10 years ago where we actually was quite successful in improving the colostrum production using either sugar beet pulp or pectin residues. And by these two fiber sources, we could have the weight gain in the colostrum period to be much higher than normal. Whereas if we fed sows potato pulp and almost the same amount of fiber than the two other sources, they were really, really bad in that group receiving the potato pulp. So it's not fiber per se, it's fiber from the correct fiber source that is doing the job. And we don't really understand what are the differences. It's not short chain fatty acids, it's more likely some of the bioactive properties that comes from fiber degradation. We have studied in other projects less addition of fiber and closer to parturition, and we did see some small numerical differences, but not something that was significant. And a French study also looked into sugar beet pulp and sunflower fiber from sunflower and soybean hulls, and they didn't see any improvement at all. So it seems to be very, very affected by the fiber source. Moving on to the lactation, I would say milk yield is really something we want to improve, and dietary lysine is important. If we undersupply, we will limit the milk production, as illustrated by the liter average daily gain, and the optimum seems to be reached when we supplied sows 68 grams of SID lysine per day. We saw a very strong and nice linear or broken line response when we considered the increasing crude protein in a dose response trial. So undersupplying is really bad for the performance. Oversupply seems to be not very bad. If I consider the body of evidence that is in the literature comparing growing pigs and sows, I would say there's a very, very heavy burden of evidence in the pig nutrition, and not much really being done in the sow nutrition. For monogastrics, it's important to consider both the productivity and the feed efficiency to minimize the impact on the climate and environment. And for the growing pigs, it's very easy to maximize the gain to feed ratio to improve the feed efficiency. But what about the lactating sows? That is very, very different. If we want as an analog to the growing piglets to maximize the kilogram of milk per kilogram of feed, it would look like this. We should simply skip feeding the sows or give them as small a meal as possible. But that is of course not the case. That is not the truth. If we consider what happens, I've done some calculations based on the study from King and Duncan, showing that if we supply sows with high amount of feed, they would produce most of the milk directly from the feed and not much from the body. But if we supply sows way less feed, they would start to produce way more milk from the body and not much from the diet. And that is really a disaster, I would say. We should aim of having the sow to produce most of the milk directly from the feed. She can do that with an energetic efficiency of 78%, meaning 22% is lost as heat. But if she's producing it from the body, we have to regain, to restore these body stores, and the overall efficiency of producing milk from the body will then be approximately 60%, meaning that 40% is lost as heat, or nearly the double amount of heat loss as compared to if we produce milk directly from the feed. So feed efficiency, when we consider that for the lactating sows, we really need to understand how much of the milk is being produced from the feed, and we have to subtract what is contributed from the sow body. And that is why we have introduced this concept of net energy corrected for body mobilization. We wanted to understand when is the sow able to extract most or produce most milk directly from the feed. And it turned out that the best protein level in the diet was 12.8 in this dose response trial, which was very, very similar to the optimum found where the productivity was maximized. It was 12.5% SID crude protein. So it seems like when we hit the right composition, we have two benefits. We have a high productivity, and we have also a high feed efficiency. A simple way of manipulating the sows is to give them more feed in the lactation, but it seems like it doesn't really help much, not on the productivity. This again is constant, even though sows end on 7.5, 8.75 kilogram per day, or 10 kilogram per day. But what is really differing is the weight loss. So more feed will reduce the weight loss, but it has not much impact on the litter gain or the milk production. So just to summarize this, sow nutrition is a delicate balance. You have an animal requirement, and if you go below that in a dietary concentration, you lose productivity. If you go above, you lose feed efficiency. And the optimum here is where we have the minimal impact on climate and on the environment. I believe very, very much in the two-component feeding strategy. I believe we should split and start to consider feeding the sow body one diet, and the mammary gland and the milk production another diet. And why that? Because the optimal composition is really difficult to target with just a single diet. If we use a single diet, it seems to be optimal at peak lactation, but it's not optimal in early lactation because sows are overfed with protein and underfed with energy. And the opposite is true here at peak lactation, where the milk production starts to decline and the feed intake is very, very high. So we should have a better balance between energy and protein, throughout the lactation period, that will give a better utilization of the nutrients and a better oxidation in the cells. We've tried to compare what happens if we use a two-component strategy, and we could see we could improve the milk yield, we could improve the weaning weight of the piglets, and we could reduce the fat mobilization of the sows. And we did another follow-up study on this, and it appeared that even no matter how bad we supplied the two dietary components, we improved the feed efficiency by at least 10%. So there's clearly some improvement we can do if we want to move on from where we are today to the two-component feeding strategy, which I see is the first step toward precision feeding. So just to conclude here, I would say insufficient energy is really problematic. It causes farrowing problems. We have to go up, if we want to have the best farrowings, we have to go up to approximately 4 kilograms per day, which is a really high feed supply. Fibers are really beneficial for the farrowings, also for the colostrum performance. And to have a high piglet survival, we have to have the sow to produce a lot of colostrum. It is indeed a very limiting factor for the individual piglets. We have realized that colostrum is being produced mainly after onset of parturition, which has caused us to think differently. And if we consider just colostrum, we could see we only need to supply 3 kilograms, which is in contrast to the feed supply for the optimal farrowing, which is approximately 4 kilograms. So what should we do? Should we feed 3 kilo or 4 kilo or somewhere in between? I believe we should optimize the feed composition so we move this optimum here closer to the 4, and then we should use close to 4 kilograms per day to have the optimal farrowing and at the same time the optimal colostrum production. During the lactation, we have to have sows to produce most of the milk directly from the feed to have a high feed efficiency. We should of course use the optimal lysine and protein supply, and also the other essential nutrients. And I believe in the future we have to move towards the precision feeding, and two-component feeding is a way to do that, because there are some very, very strong indications that we can save quite a lot of feed using that strategy. So with that, I would like to say thank you very much for your attention, and I would be happy to take your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Thiel. I believe we have a couple minutes for a few questions before the break.
Peter, can you hear me? Awesome.
Yes,
thanks.
I hope you can hear me as well.
Yeah, thanks for your presentation. In your feed allotment trial where you looked at that 3.8 to 4.1 kilo kind of being optimal for assisted farrowings, when was that feed allotted? Was that given first thing in the morning? Was that split up throughout the day? And then how did that correspond to when your sows were farrowing? So when was that meal compared to when they started farrowing?
We gave them 3 meals a day with the same time interval. So it was 8 in the morning, 4 in the afternoon, and then at midnight. We have not really done much to look into the proportion or where the actual farrowings started in that particular study. We can easily do it, but my clear feeling is there are not many that start in the morning. Then after, you can say 12 o'clock, when people start to be more quiet in the stable, then more and more farrowings occur. And our farrowings typically peak around 9 in the evening.
Thank you.
Dr. Peter, I have a question. With your study with the transition period, did you measure any metabolites in the sow's blood? I guess my question is, was it energy supply issue, the glucose supply issue, or was it some metabolites from the energy metabolism, like lactic acid, are causing issues with the piglet, or stillborn issue?
Yeah, we have both measured plasma metabolites in the sows at onset of farrowing and at end of farrowing and end of colostrum period. And we have also measured plasma metabolites in newborn piglets, where we also looked into oxygen saturation of the piglets. We looked into the 5-6 normal metabolites, energy metabolites. Well, one of them is urea as an indicator of protein oxidation. And to me, there's no doubt that sows are, if they are energy depleted, they will have a bad farrowing. If we can ensure they are having enough glucose, enough energy, they can farrow much faster. You can say glucose is not really a good indicator of how much they have been eating, because there's just a tiny amount of glucose in the blood compared to how much energy you have in the meal. But still, if you see a decline in the plasma glucose, you know, these sows, they are really challenged by their energy.
Thank you.
One more question before the break.
Hi, Professor Thiel. Just a couple of questions, actually. Do you know the ratio between insoluble and soluble fibers you recommend regarding those 500, 600 grams a day? And also, we have several studies with fiber and for the past decades. And do you know why the industry is so hesitant, still so hesitant, by using the fiber on a large scale?
Let me answer the first one, and then I would probably like you to repeat the second one, because I didn't catch that one. But the first one, soluble to insoluble, you will always have most insoluble fiber. We don't have really a good recommendation of the whether it should be a certain percentage or not. I think it's more, fermentability is really the key if we speak about the farrowing performance. The more fermentable, the more energy, the more stable energy you'll see many hours after the last meal. It's a different story if we talk about the colostrum, because then I believe it's more bioactive properties of the fibers that can cause some influence as well. And your second question, I didn't really catch that.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Why the whole industry is so hesitant to start to using the fibers in large scale? Because we have several studies, not to say hundreds of studies or thousands of studies the last decades on the fiber issue, and still the industry, it's kind of over the fence to use it. So why is your opinion? And it's a lack of studies, a lack of further research?
Maybe I can mainly explain it from the Danish side of this. I would say during the last 10 years, fibers has really come back into the diets of sows. I would say 10 years back in time, many were really afraid of fibers because they diluted the energy density. They were depressing the energy digestibility and digestibility of other nutrients and so on. But all I see around fibers around farrowing, they are positive. They have beneficial effect on the health, on the colostrum, on the satiety, on the physical activity, out become more calm and so on. And I believe I can't find anything that is negative with fibers around farrowing. But the thing is, many are actually just putting it into the diet, in the lactation diet. And then it becomes negative at peak lactation, where the fibers are filling too much in the gastrointestinal tract. They attract a lot of water, and thereby they can decrease the feed intake at peak lactation. So maybe that's the compromise. We want the fiber around farrowing. We don't want too much fiber at peak lactation. So I actually think we should try to see if we can supplement them in maybe manually or how it can be done around farrowing and not included in the lactation diet.
Thank you.
Definitely very interesting talk and intrigues a lot of thinking here. Thank you, Dr. Thiel, again before the break.
Welcome.
So we'll have a 30-minute break, and please come back at 10:40. We'll start sharply. Thank you.